The DigiPodcast, digital trends in supply chain management.
Hello and welcome to our DigiPodcast. I'm Thomas Holzer from Siemens SCM Digi Network with the DigiPodcast, a podcast on digital innovative topics for procurement in the future. Siemens celebrated its 175th anniversary this year. My guest today has reached a similar large milestone. Okay, not in years, but in experience. Joachim Scholz. Joachim looks back on 40 years of multifaceted experience at Siemens. As head of local buying and business partners, he takes care of the regions and countries for the supply chain management organization. And he also focused on people and supported numerous talents during his time at Siemens. Joachim has one certain quality. He's one of the nicest and most positive persons I know. So I'm very looking forward to this episode. Hello Joachim, I'm very happy that you are here with us today and that you are taking the time for this recording.
Hi Thomas, thanks for having me. I'm really looking forward for that session.
So let's start with the beginning of your career. Why did you join Siemens and what motivated you to be a part of it for so many years?
Maybe we have to travel a little bit in time, because when I started at Siemens it was 1983. And that was a time where a lot of unemployment was in Germany. And I applied for this apprenticeship within Siemens, as with also many other companies. At that time, it was called KWU. It was the power generation part of Siemens at that time. First, it was one of the big companies within the city where I was born in Mühl am Ruhr. Second, I heard that this company is pretty much international active. And that was something what always touches me. Even when I was a young kid or child, I always wanted to explore the world to a certain extent. And the point was, I heard they are active everywhere around the world, and I thought maybe I have the chance to mingle around with other cultures and learn much more about the world. And that was the first motivation for me to join Siemens. And when I look back from today, I think it was a pretty good decision at that time.
And I think that's not only a good decision for you, but it was also a good decision for Siemens. And making now the jump in today's area, can you shortly describe your main current activities and role?
Yeah, currently I'm taking care about all the regions in EMEA. That means all the regional procurement departments from Lisbon to Dubai and from Stockholm down to Johannesburg. There's my area of responsibility. I drive the procurement there in these countries jointly with my colleagues from pooling, because we're getting their terms and conditions and we utilize it in these particular countries, but also with our input from our colleagues from functional excellence, where we really work on the structures and processes, IT systems, sustainability, and you name it. I think I can add to the list another 50 topics. And for these regions, we're really trying to focus on certain topics and really make the difference in these different countries.
Well done. I'm only more convinced, but not surprised. Again, you work a lot with people, bring people together and help them. Looking back at your work at Siemens, what were your highlights?
The main highlight was really meeting these people, understanding these cultures, and trying to understand what is the value system behind that. Because as we all recognize when we are traveling, reaching Dubai, they have a different value system than Germany. Or also in Spain, decisions were made in a different way because they have a different value system, or they have more or less hierarchical thinking. When you work with the guys in Sweden, you always need consensus, and they discuss till the very end, and it takes sometimes months to get a decision, what we are not used to in Germany. But to understand that, respect that, and give the space, and also to give guidance in different cultures to reach a certain topic, that was quite a challenge, but also extremely excited. It only works if you really connect people by a network. When you drive them and focus them to only a few focus topics, and that is what we did. We selected 5 major focus topics where each and every country can contribute. And what we're trying to do there was always to have 80% in common, but also allow 20% based on the local values and approaches. And that makes certain things work what might not have worked in the past in the same speed or in the same quality.
I think that was one of the highlights. Maybe you have a short and crisp one.
You see, after nearly 40 years, there were so many great things where I was able to participate. When I remember the beginning of my career, there was a big project in building up a factory in Indonesia, and where I also had the chance to work there and building that factory up. That was a tremendous highlight. We worked like hell, 16, 80 hours a day, but we can see the progress every day. And when we started, we were just 2 German guys starting there. And after 1.5 years, we had 300 people producing stuff for our power plants, for example. Big highlight. Times in Singapore, where we introduced travel management with all these facets. That means bringing the cart in, consolidating the travel agencies, negotiating the flights and hotels and so on. It was another highlight. And when we met, when I was back in Germany after Singapore, the big procurement projects like redesign of procurement excellence, and building up these procurement network was also a big highlight. And I can add much more, also from the shared service times or from my times when I worked in Hamburg. There were so many, and it's clear after 40 years you have all these experiences. And when I continue that, we will add another 3 hours only for the highlights.
I think it's a good idea that we maybe continue next year in summer with a highlight and maybe also a lowlight session. So have you also some challenges that were not always working in a way you wanted?
Pretty a lot. But you said I'm a quite positive person, and I intend to forget these things and overcome it to a certain way. But yes, I had also some negative experiences. That was mainly with one of my bosses, what I had, where I didn't share the same idea of working. Yeah, so actually, just an example, we had to prepare the budget for the board discussion, and this gentleman at that time was traveling in the US. He called me at 11 o'clock in the night. We went through the slides, and he wants me to prepare everything till 3 o'clock in the morning. But we had still 8 weeks to go for the budget presentation, where I refused to continue and say, no, this is not necessary. And it ended up in certain hiccups on a personal level, where I then, after a certain period, after 3 months, decided I think it's the right time for moving and going the next step in my career. That was a very personal situation. Others, you see, Thomas, I always try to drive change, but we also know Siemens is a big company. Not every project, not every idea I was able to drive the change. A lot, but not all.
I think that's nothing bad, because we are only human, and as you said, we are a huge company. I think we are now a little bit more flexible, but in the past there was always room for improvement, and I think there's still some. Thank you that we have people like you. Linked to your highlights, which you have just mentioned, you worked abroad for quite some time. Maybe you can shortly describe where have you been, and maybe you should share or could share one local takeaway.
My first time abroad was 1989 to 1991. That was in Cilegon, Indonesia, some 180 kilometers west of Jakarta. We built up a factory there in the middle of a rice field. There was nothing around. There was even no power, electrical power. We had to maintain our own power plant. And we onboarded the people from the regions, and there were rice farmers in the beginning. So the first 3 months we were really training them how to operate machines and these things. And it was so excited that you really were there, say, hey, you're building your own company there. Yes, Siemens was on the back. They give you funds and all these things, but we had to reinvent everything on our own. And after leaving this spot in Indonesia, we had 250 people working for us, and we had a revenue of $18 million. And that was quite a great challenge. But I was selected since before I went to Indonesia, I was the procurement buyer, the buyer who bought all the machinery. And then they decided to send me there. So you bought everything, now you get everything out of customs and you build it up. That was part one. And the second part was Singapore, where I had the chance to be the commercial head, logistics, IT, and travel management head for Southeast Asia. But to go to Singapore was a special story, because I had a business trip for 3 weeks to the US, and I was fascinated from working abroad. Came back to my boss and told him, you know what, it was so great, I will go abroad. And my boss said, yeah, please continue it now here in Germany. And then I recognized he didn't get the message. So 4 weeks later, I went to him and said, here, you have this strip with all the numbers, in Germany we call it Maßband. And I said, you see here, there are 6 months on it, 180 days. And every day now I will put you a number on the table, because latest when this is 0, I will move on, either with your help or without your help. And then sometimes luck and opportunity meets. When we were working on personal exchange ideas there, my big boss entered the room and I told him, hey, do you know that I'm going abroad? Where my boss said, yeah, don't take him so serious. And my big boss said, hey, that's a good idea. I need somebody in Hong Kong. And I was in business at that moment. So it was planned to go to Hong Kong for 3 years. And on short notice, actually, everything was already settled. Flat was already selected in Hong Kong. Then I got another call from my big boss. He said, I changed my mind. I don't need somebody in Hong Kong. I need somebody in Singapore. Would you also go to Singapore? And I said, this is a decision. It's a family decision. I will not take it by myself. I first need to talk to my wife, where he said, fair enough. But within 20 minutes, the decision was made that we will go with our small kid, our small daughter, move on to Singapore. And the best outcome out of both situations abroad was the widen of the horizon, to accept that it's not always the German way how to approach things.
I think especially for the younger ones that are listening to our podcast, I think that's really valuable, that going abroad for a longer time, not only for 6 months for a kind of paid holiday, is a very interesting experience. And reflecting this, is there something you would do differently back in your early years with the experience you have now?
Earlier, no, it was okay, because I started 83 with my apprenticeship. I became a buyer in 86, and then going abroad in 89 was good, because then I had enough foundation and know how the game works. That was good. And then another experience later, first in corporate procurement and also a job in between where I worked with HR. Singapore was also okay. But later, maybe after the return to Germany in 98, 10 years later, I would have been ready also to go again abroad, but there was no opportunity, what would fit also in the family situation at that point of time. I can only recommend to each and everybody, if you have the chance to go abroad, do it, because you come back as a different person. You have a complete different horizon in that, and this is a real enrichment in life.
Regarding this living abroad, I can only agree, and I think what's interesting, your step-by-step approach, how you build experience. I think that's not normal nowadays. Regarding this approach and the changes, how did, from your point of view, Siemens change within the last 40 years?
I think we were changing from a pretty much administrative-focused company with very stagnant rules into a much more dynamic company, much more openness, less hierarchy, everybody approachable, and this is completely different company. When I remember the beginning, it was even clear how big your office should be, whether you have curtains or not, everything was regulated, and this is gone completely.
Can only share your opinion, but what is your estimation on the current market and especially on the future?
When I see what is currently happening, and I hear that from my colleagues from pooling and also from the business, yes, we have shortage in a lot of material fields, and I never experienced that. I think we are at the dawn of a big change. In the past, we pooled everything as much as possible with one supplier. Sometimes we had two, but especially the last 3 years has shown that this strategy might not fit in the future anymore. Also seeing US, China decoupling to a certain extent, I think we need to move more responsibility into the regions, because we might need to build up parallel supply chains. Maybe there will be a supply chain for the US, maybe one for China, and maybe some for Europe. And we need really to utilize the potential of the local market much, much more. Not saying that we should localize everything, but wherever it makes sense from the material structure, there a more regional focus, in my opinion, needs to be done.
2 comments. One is, again, your heart is beating for the regions, and I think that's now your time. And you mentioned before the 80-20 approach, so maybe it's in the future the 60-40 approach, where we have done more local topics. From a very senior guy, for the more junior ones, good indication what could happen in the future. But enough about the hardcore supply chain topics. I know that we share a quite similar passion, and it's about people and talents. And would be great if you could share a little bit of advice for young talents or also some elder talents.
So when I deal with people, the first thing what I try to do, I try to see the person's holistics. Not just as a worker or a contributor to work. We need to see the entire person. So person is driven by feelings. And as long as when we can create an environment where the people feel well, they will be ready to give as much as possible. That is point one. Point two, we have to accept the people as they are. So we should not try to change any kind of character. Yes, we should build knowledge, but not change the attitude. The attitude is the most important thing. Third thing, when people want to move on in their career, I have a certain theory. I call it always the 3-leg theory. And it was introduced to me when I started my apprenticeship. And my boss at that time, a very wise lady, told me, if you want to go for career, you should have 3 steps. You should cover a factory. You should work in a factory. You should work in a sales department or in a region, and you should work in corporate. Why doing that? That means you can connect networks. You are the biggest knot in the network, and being a knot in the network means you can gather information from different angles. That is one thing. The other part of the 3-leg theory is try to work in 3 different departments. I did this commercial apprenticeship. So when I started in procurement. After that, I worked in HR for people's development thing, and I had a BA head or commercial head of certain organization, and then shared services. So the more diversity you bring in, the bigger your network is, the more input you get from different angles on overseeing a situation. Because at the end of the day, once you enter the management and you have to take decision, you anyway have maximum 60% of facts, and the rest 40%, you need to make yourself sure whether you can deal with the risks and what can happen if this decision is wrong. And then you need to have a mitigation plan. How do you act once something goes wrong? So that was it a bit in a nutshell. I think I could continue for hours. But this is my idea what I would recommend. And especially when you are young in your career, you are not that expensive for the company, and it's easy to move on. Yeah, believe me, the more expensive you are, the harder it is to get an interesting position. But when you are young, you build up a unique selling point for that later, and it makes you really relevant and interesting for the company and also for the employment market.
Achim, I can only confirm. I think I wasn't aware of your theory, but I think I was also in several locations of departments and regions. I had different departments and companies, and especially when you're young, you're not so expensive, so you can move a little bit faster. And especially nowadays, the new generations have sometimes a different approach. And I think that's also interesting. Maybe we can continue this again in our second podcast next year with some, say, reflection time in between, because that goes to the next question. What happens next with you, Achim? What are your plans for the future?
So what happens next? I will come back, celebrate Christmas, New Year, and so on. Then we will have a lot of travel, my wife and me, because we're in a luxury position that she's also not working anymore. So we can spend a lot of time. And on top of it, there was a consultancy company who asked me whether I could support them with certain senior advisor role. And here and there, I will support them with their customers, especially in the fields of procurement and shared services. That will be a role. And the rest is the total freedom. I do not have a schedule anymore. So I can decide every morning whether I wake up at 7 or at 10. I can decide every morning whether I read only the first 3 pages of the newspaper or the full newspaper, and so on. So that is the big luxury what I have, and I'm really looking forward. Nevertheless, I always loved to work for the company and work with the people, and that is also what I will miss.
But Achim, I'm convinced you won't miss the people because the people will come to you. So we have now a very special podcast, and I think we are breaking every time boundary so far, but for me it was worth it. It was really very, very insightful. Thank you for sharing 40 years of product experience with your wonderful positive personality. Before we end, I have to say thank you to Christiane and Sina, who recorded this episode together with Joachim on site in Munich. To all our listeners, I hope you enjoyed our episode of this DigiPodcast. If you have questions or if you want to find out more about the SCM Digi Network, reach out to our internet page, siemens.com/DigiNetwork. I'm looking forward to having you as a listener at our next episode. Yours, Thomas Holzner from the SCM Digi Network. Goodbye.
The DigiPodcast, Digital Trends in Supply Chain Management.